Picture this. A quiet man in his 30s walks into a civilian shooting range on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. He's wearing a simple jacket and jeans. Nothing fancy. The other shooters glance at him and see someone they assume is just another weekend warrior trying to impress friends. They have no idea they're looking at a ghost, a man whose rifle once spoke death from impossible distances in the mountains of Afghanistan, whose hands have steadied on triggers that decided the fate of entire operations, whose eyes have seen through scopes that most soldiers only dream of touching. Today, he just wants to practice in peace. But sometimes, the past has other plans. What happens when ordinary people mock extraordinary skills they cannot comprehend? What unfolds when a legend walks among us unrecognized and underestimated? This is the story of Staff Sergeant James Mitchell, a man carrying secrets that could fill libraries, standing quietly while lesser shooters laugh at his humble appearance. They think they know what they're seeing. They have no idea what's about to happen. James Mitchell pushed open the glass doors of Precision Point shooting range, the familiar smell of gunpowder and cleaning oil washing over him like an old friend's embrace. The Tuesday afternoon crowd was thin, just how he preferred it. After spending his morning shift standing perfectly still outside Buckingham Palace, his shoulders ached for movement, his mind craved the focused calm that only came from behind a rifle scope. He approached the front counter where a young clerk with sleeve tattoos looked up from his phone. "First time here?" the clerk asked, eyeing James's unremarkable appearance. James wore a faded blue jacket over dark jeans, looking more like a librarian than someone who belonged at a shooting range. "Yes," James replied simply, his voice carrying the soft accent of someone from Yorkshire. He filled out the paperwork with practiced efficiency, his penmanship neat and precise. Under occupation, he wrote "security guard" without hesitation. It wasn't technically a lie. The clerk handed him safety glasses and ear protection. "Lane 12 is open. You bringing your own equipment or need a rental?" "I'll rent today." James paid for a standard hunting rifle, nothing fancy. He wasn't here to show off or prove anything to strangers. He just needed to shoot. Lane 12 sat at the far end of the range, exactly where James wanted to be. As he walked past the other shooters, he caught snippets of conversation. Two men in their 40s were arguing about grain weights and ballistic coefficients, their voices carrying the confidence of people who had read every gun magazine ever published. A younger man was attempting to impress his girlfriend with stories about his father's hunting expeditions, each tale growing more dramatic with each telling. James set up his equipment quietly, methodically checking the rifle he had been given. It was a decent weapon, well-maintained, but nothing special. He adjusted the scope with small, precise movements, his fingers working with the unconscious competence of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. At the lane next to him, a heavy-set man named Tony was struggling with his shots. Tony owned a construction company and considered himself something of an expert marksman. He had been coming to this range for 3 years and knew most of the regular shooters. When he noticed the quiet man in the next lane, he felt obligated to offer advice. "First time shooting?" Tony called over, his voice friendly but condescending. "That rifle you got there is okay for beginners, but if you really want to learn proper shooting, you need something with more punch." James nodded politely. "I appreciate the advice." "See, the thing about shooting is it's all about confidence," Tony continued, warming to his subject. "You can't be timid about it. Got to really commit to each shot." He fired his own rifle, the bullet striking the target somewhere in the outer rings, like that. Clean shot. James loaded his magazine with 5 rounds. His movements economical and smooth. He had learned long ago that the best way to handle unwanted attention was to simply be pleasant and unremarkable. Let people see what they expected to see. The rangemaster, a retired police officer named Frank, was making his rounds when he stopped behind James's lane. Frank had been running shooting ranges for 15 years and prided himself on being able to spot different types of shooters. Military guys usually had a particular way of handling weapons, but this quiet fellow in the cheap jacket didn't fit the pattern. Probably just another office worker trying to feel tough on his day off. "Target distance?" Frank asked. 100 yards to start," James replied. Frank nodded and set the target. 100 yards was standard for most civilian shooters, though many struggled to hit anything meaningful at that distance. He watched as James settled into a shooting position, noting that the man's stance was decent enough. Probably watched some YouTube videos. Tony was reloading when he glanced over at James. "You military or police or anything?" he asked. "Security work," James answered, bringing the rifle to his shoulder. Mall cop type stuff," Tony said with a knowing nod. "Well, don't feel bad if you don't hit much today. Takes years to get really good at this. I've been shooting since I was 12, and I'm still learning new things." James aligned his sight picture. his breathing automatically falling into the rhythm he had learned in another life. 2 seconds of natural respiratory pause, squeeze the trigger straight back, follow through. The rifle spoke once, a clean, sharp crack that cut through the ambient noise of the range. Through his spotting scope, Tony tried to see where the shot had landed. "Don't see a hole," he called out cheerfully. "Probably sailed right over the target. Happens to everybody starting out." But Frank, watching through his own binoculars, could see perfectly well where the bullet had struck. Dead center of the bullseye, a hole so precisely placed it looked like it had been drilled there by a machine. He blinked and looked again, certain he had made a mistake. James fired his second shot without ceremony, settling back into position as if he was simply performing a mundane task. Then his third. Fourth, fifth. Each shot followed the same methodical rhythm, each one placed with mechanical precision. When the magazine was empty, James set the rifle down and pressed the button to bring his target forward. As the paper target traveled down the range toward him, the other shooters gradually became aware that something unusual was happening. "Holy hell," whispered the young man who had been trying to impress his girlfriend. "Look at that target." Tony lowered his binoculars, confusion replacing his previous confidence. "That can't be right." Frank walked over to examine the target as it reached the firing line. 5 shots had been fired. There was one hole in the exact center of the bullseye, but the edges were slightly torn, indicating that multiple bullets had passed through the same point. It was the kind of grouping that professional competition shooters struggle to achieve with precision equipment under perfect conditions. "Must be a fluke," Tony said, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty. Wind probably carried all the shots to the same spot by coincidence. James was already reloading for his next series when Frank approached him. "Son, I've been around shooting sports my whole life. That's some impressive marksmanship." "Thank you," James replied simply, not looking up from his rifle preparation. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" "Here and there," James said, which was both true and completely unhelpful. The other shooters were beginning to gather behind James's lane, drawn by the extraordinary target. Word was spreading through the range that something remarkable was happening at lane 12. A woman named Sarah, who taught shooting classes on weekends, came over to see what the fuss was about. "That's got to be beginner's luck," she declared, examining the target. "Nobody shoots groups that tight on their first visit to a range." James set his target back to 100 yards and loaded another magazine. He was beginning to regret choosing such a busy afternoon for practice. All he wanted was some quiet time to keep his skills sharp, but now he was becoming the center of attention. Tony, feeling his reputation as the ranger's informal expert being challenged by this nobody in a cheap jacket, decided to escalate things. "Tell you what, friend," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "How about we make this interesting? $50 says you can't do that again." James looked up at him calmly. "I don't gamble. Come on, it was obviously just luck. Prove me wrong." Other shooters were nodding encouragement, sensing drama. Frank should have intervened, but even he was curious to see what would happen next. In all his years running ranges, he had never seen a group that tight from someone who claimed to be a beginner. "I'm just here to practice," James said quietly. "Practice for what? More security training?" Tony pressed, getting a few chuckles from the growing audience. James felt something shift inside him, a familiar coldness that he had learned to keep carefully controlled. In the mountains of Afghanistan, that coldness had kept him alive. Here, surrounded by weekend warriors and armchair experts, it was simply irritating. 200 yards, James said finally. Tony laughed. "Now you're talking. 200 yards, and let's make it 5 shots again." $50 says you can't even hit the target. Frank reset the target to 200 yards, twice the distance most civilian shooters attempted. At that range, wind, humidity, and even small variations in ammunition could throw shots several inches off target. It required genuine skill to maintain accuracy. James settled back into position, but this time, something was different. The casual observers gathered behind him noticed that his entire demeanor had changed. His movements became more deliberate, more focused. He adjusted the scope with tiny increments, accounting for the increased distance. Sarah, the shooting instructor, watched him work and felt a chill of recognition. She had seen this kind of systematic preparation before, during her brief stint in the Army Reserve. This wasn't how recreational shooters behaved. "Where did you say you learned to shoot?" she asked quietly. James didn't answer. He was already in what his old teammates would have called the zone, that state of perfect concentration where the world narrowed to just the rifle, the target, and the mathematical relationship between them. His first shot at 200 yards struck dead center. The second shot expanded the hole by mere millimeters. By the third shot, the gathered crowd had fallen completely silent. Tony was staring through his spotting scope, his mouth slightly open. This isn't possible. James fired his fourth and fifth shots with the same mechanical precision, then set the rifle down and activated the target retrieval. As the paper traveled back toward them, everyone could see that once again there was essentially one hole where 5 bullets had passed through. "Okay," Frank said slowly. "I think we need to have a conversation about who you really are." James stood and checked his watch. His shift at the palace started early tomorrow morning, and he needed to get home. "Just someone who enjoys shooting," he said. "Nobody shoots like that without serious training," Sarah insisted. "Military?" "Security work," James repeated. Tony, his confidence completely shattered, managed to stammer, "Where the hell do you work security that teaches shooting like that?" James packed his equipment methodically, ignoring the questions being fired at him from all directions. He had said too much already, revealed too much. In his previous life, anonymity was survival. Old habits died hard. As he headed for the exit, Frank called after him. "Will we see you here again?" James paused at the door. Probably not. After he left, the shooting range buzzed with speculation and theories. Tony spent the rest of the afternoon trying to replicate James's performance and failing spectacularly. Sarah pulled Frank aside and told him she thought the quiet man might have special forces training, but Frank dismissed the idea. Special forces soldiers didn't work mall security jobs. None of them could have imagined the truth. They had just watched one of the most lethal snipers in British military history casually demonstrate skills that he had used to change the outcome of battles in 3 different countries. Skills that had made him a legend among soldiers who dealt in legends every day. James Mitchell drove home through London traffic, already regretting his decision to visit a civilian range. Tomorrow he would return to his post outside Buckingham Palace, standing perfectly still in his red uniform and bearskin hat, just another anonymous guard protecting the crown. Tourists would take pictures with him, children would try to make him smile, and nobody would suspect that the man behind the stoic facade had once been the most feared sniper in the SAS. But tonight, for just a few hours, his cover had slipped. And in a world where his survival had always depended on remaining invisible, that was a problem he would need to consider very carefully. 3 days after James Mitchell's visit to Precision Point, the shooting range was still buzzing with stories about the mysterious man who had humiliated their best shooters. Tony had returned every day since, determined to prove that what he had witnessed was either a fluke or some kind of trick. Each session ended with him staring at targets that looked like they had been attacked by a shotgun compared to the surgical precision he had seen. Frank found himself reviewing the security footage repeatedly, watching James's shooting, form, frame by frame. The man's stance, his grip, the way he controlled his breathing. Everything suggested training far beyond anything a civilian security guard would receive. But James's paperwork had been completely ordinary. His demeanor unremarkable except for those few minutes when he had transformed into something else entirely. Sarah, meanwhile, had been making phone calls. Her brother worked as a recruiter for the army and had connections throughout the military community. She described the shooting performance she had witnessed, but her contacts dismissed it as exaggeration. Civilians always embellished military stories, they said. Nobody shot groups that tight without competition-grade equipment and perfect conditions. Word of the incident spread beyond Precision Point through the tight-knit community of London shooting enthusiasts. By the weekend, 3 other rangers had heard various versions of the story. Some claimed the mysterious shooter had hit bullseyes while blindfolded. Others insisted he had used an antique rifle from World War II. Each retelling added new details, transforming James's quiet demonstration into urban legend. At the Hendon Police College, Detective Inspector Marcus Webb was having coffee with his old friend Colin Hayes, a former SAS sergeant who now worked private security. Colin had heard the story from his nephew, who knew someone who had been at Precision Point that Tuesday. 5 shots through the same hole at 200 yards, Colin was saying, shaking his head. With a rental rifle. Either this story is complete bollocks, or we've got a serious professional walking around London pretending to be a mall cop. Webb stirred his coffee thoughtfully. In his 23 years with the Metropolitan Police, he had encountered enough military veterans hiding in plain sight to know that Colin's second option wasn't as unlikely as it sounded. "What kind of professional?" "The kind that doesn't officially exist," Colin replied. "Regiment guys, mainly. Snipers who did work that never made it into any reports. Some of them have trouble adjusting to civilian life, take whatever jobs they can find that let them blend in." Webb made a mental note to run some background checks. If there was a former Special Forces operator working security in London, he wanted to know about it. Not because he suspected any wrongdoing, but because, in his experience, men with those kinds of skills rarely stayed invisible for long. Trouble had a way of finding them. Meanwhile, James was going about his normal routine, completely unaware of the ripples his shooting demonstration had created. His morning shift at Buckingham Palace passed without incident, tourists snapping photos while he maintained the rigid posture required of the Queen's Guard. The red uniform and massive bearskin hat made him anonymous in a different way, transforming him into a symbol rather than a person. During his lunch break, James walked through St. James's Park, a habit he had developed over his 3 years in the position. The familiar weight of the SA-80 rifle on his shoulder was comforting, even though it was loaded with blanks for ceremonial purposes. After years carrying weapons that could reach out and touch targets at extraordinary distances, the assault rifle felt almost toy-like in comparison. He was feeding the ducks when his phone buzzed with a text from his sister Emma. Saw the weirdest thing on Facebook. Someone posting about a mysterious super soldier at a shooting range. Reminded me of all those stories you used to tell about Afghanistan. Miss those days? James deleted the message without responding. Emma had no idea how close to home her casual observation had landed. She remembered him as her little brother who had joined the army straight out of school and come back different after his tours overseas. She knew he had seen combat, but the specifics of his service were classified at levels that meant he could never share them, even with family. The truth was that James missed those days more than he could admit. Not the violence or the constant danger, but the sense of purpose, the knowledge that his skills mattered in ways that could change the outcome of entire operations. Standing guard outside a palace where the most exciting event was usually a confused tourist asking for directions felt like a profound waste of his capabilities. But it was also safe. In his previous life, every mission had carried the possibility that he might not return. His wife Sarah, not the shooting instructor from the range, but his ex-wife who had left him 2 years ago, had lived with that uncertainty until she couldn't anymore. "You're never really here," she had told him during their last fight. "Even when you're sitting right next to me, you're somewhere else, thinking about things I can't understand." She hadn't been wrong. The mental habits that kept a sniper alive in hostile territory didn't translate well to domestic life. Constantly scanning for threats, automatically cataloging exits and defensive positions, maintaining emotional distance from everyone around you. These weren't traits that built strong marriages. James finished feeding the ducks and checked his watch. 20 minutes left on his break. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through news websites, a habit from his operational days when staying informed about global events had been crucial to his survival. The world was still full of conflict, still full of places where his particular skills would be valuable, but those places were behind him now, part of a chapter of his life that was officially closed. Back at Precision Point, Frank was dealing with an unexpected problem. Word about the mysterious shooter had reached the ears of several competitive marksmen, and they were demanding to know more details. A man named Gerald Pemberton, who held several regional shooting records, had driven down from Manchester specifically to challenge this unknown shooter to a match. "I've been shooting competitively for 30 years, Pemberton declared, his expensive equipment cases stacked beside the front counter. "Nobody shoots groups that tight without years of professional training and the best equipment money can buy. This story your customers are spreading is damaging the credibility of serious marksmanship." Frank tried to explain that James had simply been a walk-in customer who hadn't left any contact information, but Pemberton wasn't satisfied. He spent the entire afternoon at the range, demanding to examine the targets, studying the security footage, and questioning anyone who had witnessed the shooting. "This is preposterous," Pemberton muttered, reviewing the video for the 10th time. "Look at his form. He's using a basic hunting rifle like it's a precision instrument. No competition shooter would even attempt those shots without proper bench rests and wind flags." Sarah, who happened to be giving a lesson that afternoon, overheard Pemberton's complaints. "Maybe he wasn't a competition shooter," she suggested. "Then what was he? Some kind of Olympic biathlon competitor? Military sniper?" Pemberton laughed at his own suggestion. "Real military snipers don't work security jobs and practice at civilian ranges." But as soon as the words left his mouth, Pemberton paused. His grandfather had served in the Falklands War and told stories about Special Forces soldiers whose official records had been scrubbed clean for security reasons. Men who had done extraordinary things but could never be publicly acknowledged for their service. "You're suggesting this fellow was what, SAS?" Frank asked. "I'm not suggesting anything," Pemberton replied quickly. "I'm simply saying that the shooting performance you've described is consistent with advanced military training." And if that's the case, then this individual chose to reveal his capabilities in a very public way, which suggests either poor judgment or some kind of psychological issue. Miles away, James was beginning the afternoon shift of his guard duty, unaware that his 15 minutes at a shooting range had triggered a cascade of speculation and investigation. He stood at his post, rifle at present arms, watching tourists and thinking about his evening plans. He had been considering finding a new range, somewhere more isolated, where he could practice without attracting attention. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent his days dressed as a soldier, carrying a rifle, while hiding the fact that he had once been one of the most effective soldiers in the British military. The uniform made him invisible through its very obviousness. Nobody looked at a Queen's Guard and wondered about his combat experience. They saw only the tradition and pageantry. At 5 o'clock, Detective Inspector Webb ran James Mitchell's name through the police database, along with several variations and possible aliases. The search returned exactly what he expected from someone who had served in classified units: basic biographical information, service dates with significant gaps, and a security clearance level that required special authorization even to view. Webb leaned back in his chair and considered his options. The man existed, had military service, and currently worked as a ceremonial guard. Nothing in the official record suggested anything unusual or concerning, but the gaps in the timeline were interesting, particularly a 3-year period that showed no official postings despite continuous active service status. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Colin Hayes calling back with information from his own sources. "I asked around about your mysterious shooter," Colin said, without preamble. "Didn't get much, but I got something. Guy I know in Hereford went very quiet when I described the shooting performance. Then he asked me why I was asking questions about a former regiment sniper who was supposed to be completely off the radar." Webb felt a familiar tingle of professional curiosity. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. But he told me something interesting. Said if there really was a former SAS sniper working a civilian job in London, it would be because he was trying very hard to stay invisible. And the kind of man who needs to stay invisible usually has very good reasons." After hanging up, Webb stared at his computer screen for several minutes. James Mitchell was beginning to look like more than just an eccentric shooting enthusiast. But what exactly he was and whether it posed any kind of problem remained unclear. The next morning, James arrived at Wellington Barracks for the changing of the guard ceremony, completely unaware that his name was being discussed in police offices and military circles around London. He went through the familiar routine of inspecting his uniform, checking his rifle, and preparing for another day of standing perfectly still while tourists took pictures. As he marched to his position outside Buckingham Palace, James caught a glimpse of a man in civilian clothes watching the guards with unusual intensity. The man wasn't taking pictures like a typical tourist, wasn't pointing out details to companions. He was simply observing, his eyes tracking the guards with the focused attention of someone looking for specific information. James filed the observation away without changing his expression or posture. In his previous life, that kind of surveillance awareness had been automatic, essential for survival. Now it was just another reminder that some skills never really went away, no matter how much you wanted to leave them behind. The man watching was Detective Inspector Webb, conducting his own quiet investigation into the mysterious shooter. He had come to see James Mitchell in his official capacity, to get a sense of the person behind the remarkable shooting story. What Webb saw was a perfectly ordinary ceremonial guard, indistinguishable from his colleagues, except perhaps for a slightly more alert posture. But for someone trained to notice such things, there were small details that didn't quite fit. The way Mitchell scanned the crowd, the subtle tension in his shoulders that suggested constant readiness, the complete stillness that went beyond mere discipline. Webb watched for 20 minutes before walking away. James Mitchell looked exactly like what he claimed to be, a security guard doing his job. But everything about his bearing suggested a man who had learned that job in places where mistakes cost lives, not careers. Detective Inspector Marcus Webb had been in police work long enough to recognize when a simple inquiry was turning into something more complex. What had started as casual curiosity about a shooting range story was evolving into a proper investigation, driven by questions that seemed to multiply with every answer he uncovered. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Amanda Foster, a military psychologist who consulted with the Metropolitan Police on cases involving veterans, called Webb 3 days after his visit to Buckingham Palace. "Marcus, I heard you are asking questions about former Special Forces personnel," Dr. Foster said. "I may have some information that could interest you." They met at a quiet cafe near her office in Harley Street. "Doctor, Foster was in her 50s, with graying hair and the kind of calm demeanor that came from years of helping soldiers deal with trauma most civilians couldn't imagine. "I can't discuss specific patients," she began, "but I can tell you that we see a concerning pattern among certain veterans. Highly skilled soldiers who transition poorly to civilian life often seek jobs that provide structure and anonymity. Palace guards, museum security, night watchmen, positions where they can maintain military-style discipline while avoiding situations that might trigger their more specialized training." Webb stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "Are we talking about psychological problems?" "Not necessarily. Some of these men simply find civilian life insufficiently challenging. They're accustomed to high-stakes environments where their skills matter. Standing guard outside a palace isn't therapy, it's camouflage. They're hiding from their own capabilities. What happens when the camouflage slips?" Dr. Foster's expression grew more serious. "That depends on the individual. Most of the time, nothing. They recognize their mistake and become more careful about maintaining their cover. But occasionally, we see cases where the veteran begins seeking situations that allow them to use their training again." Webb thought about the shooting range incident. A man demonstrating extraordinary marksmanship skills in a room full of witnesses definitely qualified as slipped camouflage. "How would you recommend approaching someone like this?" "Very carefully," Dr. Foster replied. "If we're talking about a former Special Forces operator, you're dealing with someone trained to assess threats and respond accordingly. Direct confrontation would be counterproductive. Subtle observation would be safer." But James Mitchell had already noticed the subtle observation. During his morning shift, he had spotted the same plainclothes officer who had watched the changing of the guard the previous day. The man was trying to blend in with tourists, but his positioning and behavior marked him as clearly as if he wore a uniform. James completed his guard duty without acknowledging the surveillance, but afterward he made several seemingly casual detours through London streets, using shop windows and reflective surfaces to confirm what he already suspected. He was being followed, professionally but not expertly. Police surveillance, not intelligence services. That evening, James sat in his small flat in Bermondsey, considering his options. The shooting range visit had been a mistake, an uncharacteristic lapse in judgment that was now creating exactly the kind of attention he had spent 3 years avoiding. The smart thing would be to maintain his routine, avoid any behavior that might confirm suspicions about his background. But part of him was tired of hiding. The skills that had once defined him, that had saved countless lives and completed impossible missions, were going to waste while he stood motionless in a ceremonial uniform. The shooting range had reminded him of what he was capable of, had awakened something that he thought he had successfully buried. Meanwhile, across London, Gerald Pemberton was conducting his own investigation into the mysterious shooter. Unlike Webb's careful police work, Pemberton's approach was more direct and considerably less subtle. He had returned to Precision Point every day since his first visit, interviewing anyone who had witnessed James's shooting performance. He measured distances, tested different rifles, and analyzed wind conditions, trying to find some explanation for the extraordinary accuracy he had heard described. "It's mathematically impossible," Pemberton declared to Frank during his latest visit. "The variables alone, rifle consistency, ammunition quality, atmospheric conditions, make that level of precision completely unrealistic for a casual shooter." Frank was growing tired of Pemberton's obsession. Maybe the man was just having a good day. Good days don't account for groups measuring less than half an inch at 200 yards. Pemberton insisted. "That's competition-grade performance using equipment that shouldn't be capable of it. Either this individual has access to training and experience far beyond what you're describing, or we're dealing with something else entirely." "Such as?" Pemberton hesitated. His theory was beginning to sound paranoid even to himself. "Professional conditioning, someone who shoots for a living, not recreation. You're suggesting he was what, a hired killer?" Frank's tone was skeptical. "I'm suggesting he was someone whose livelihood depended on extreme accuracy. Military sniper, competitive shooter, something that would explain the skill level." But Pemberton's questions hadn't gone unnoticed. Sarah, the shooting instructor who had been present during James's visit, had grown uncomfortable with the intense scrutiny. She called Detective Inspector Webb directly, having gotten his number through mutual contacts in law enforcement. "I think you should know," she told Webb. "There's a competitive shooter named Gerald Pemberton who's been asking very detailed questions about the incident at our range. He's becoming obsessive about it." Webb thanked her for the information and added Pemberton's name to his growing list of people to monitor. What had started as a simple background check was turning into a complex web of civilian investigators, each pursuing their own theories about James Mitchell's identity. The situation became more complicated when Colin Hayes, Webb's former SAS contact, called with disturbing news. "That sniper I mentioned," Colin said. "I did some more asking around. Word is he disappeared from service under classified circumstances, not dishonorably discharged, not killed in action, just gone from the official record. The kind of gone that suggests witness protection or something similar." Webb felt a chill of professional concern. "Witness protection from what?" "Don't know. But if a regiment sniper needs to hide his identity, it usually means he made enemies who are still looking for him. The kind of enemies who don't give up." This new information cast James's desire for anonymity in a different light. It wasn't just about adjusting to civilian life, it might be about survival. And if that was the case, then all the attention generated by his shooting demonstration could be putting him in real danger. Webb made a decision that went against standard procedure. Instead of continuing surveillance, he would approach James Mitchell directly, not as a police investigation, but as a conversation between one professional and another. The next morning, Webb positioned himself along James's usual route through St. James's Park during lunch break. When James appeared, walking alone and maintaining the casual alertness that Webb now recognized as tradecraft, the detective fell into step beside him. "Mr. Mitchell?" Webb said quietly. "I wonder if we might have a word." James didn't break stride, didn't show any surprise. "About what?" "About a shooting demonstration that's attracted more attention than you probably intended." James stopped walking and turned to face Webb directly. For the first time, the detective got a clear look at the man he had been investigating. James Mitchell had the kind of calm, measuring gaze that Webb associated with dangerous individuals. Not criminals necessarily, but people who had learned to assess threats quickly and respond accordingly.
"You're police," James said.
It wasn't a question. "Detective Inspector Marcus Webb, Metropolitan Police. I'm not here in an official capacity." "Then why are you here?" Webb chose his words carefully. "Because I think you may have a problem you're not aware of. Your shooting performance has generated a lot of interest from people who aren't as discreet as they should be." James considered this information. What kind of people? Competitive shooters asking detailed questions. Military personnel trying to verify stories they've heard. The kind of attention that could compromise someone who values privacy. "And you're telling me this because I served in Northern Ireland in the 90s. I know what it looks like when someone is trying very hard to stay invisible. And I know it usually means they have good reasons." James studied Webb's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. After several seconds, he seemed to reach a decision. "Walk with me," James said. They continued through the park in silence for several minutes before James spoke again. 3 years ago, I left a job that required certain skills. I took the Palace Guard position because it offered structure and anonymity. I've been very careful to maintain both. Until the shooting range." "Until the shooting range," James confirmed. A momentary lapse in judgment. Webb nodded. "We all have moments like that. The question is, how much damage has been done?" "You tell me. You're the one tracking the aftermath." Webb gave him a brief summary of the various investigations and theories circulating around London's shooting community. James listened without comment, but Webb could see the tension building in his shoulders. "How serious is this?" James asked finally. "That depends on what you're hiding from. If it's just professional embarrassment, probably not very. If it's something more serious..." Webb let the sentence hang. James was quiet for a long time, weighing options and calculating risks. The conversation was already more than he should have revealed, but he found himself trusting this policeman's straightforward approach. "The people I used to work for classified my service at levels that make it effectively invisible," James said finally. "But that classification also means that certain individuals I encountered during that service don't officially know who I am or where I might be found. Certain individuals who might be interested in revenge? Certain individuals who might be interested in preventing me from testifying about things that officially never happened." Webb understood immediately. James Mitchell wasn't just a former soldier seeking anonymity. He was a witness to classified operations whose exposure could damage powerful interests. The shooting range incident hadn't just compromised his privacy, it had potentially exposed him to people who had very good reasons to want him permanently silent. "What do you need?" Webb asked. "I need the stories to stop spreading. I need the investigations to go away. And I need to disappear again before the wrong people start asking questions." Webb nodded. "I can help with the first two. The third is up to you." As they parted ways, Both men understood that James Mitchell's attempt at a normal life was probably over. The skills that had made him invaluable as a soldier had also made him a permanent target. And now, thanks to a few casual shots at a civilian shooting range, his enemies might finally have a trail to follow. Detective Inspector Webb moved quickly after his conversation with James Mitchell. His first priority was damage control, shutting down the amateur investigations before they attracted the kind of attention that could get people killed. He started with Gerald Pemberton, the obsessive competitive shooter who had been conducting his own inquiry into the mysterious marksman. Webb found Pemberton at Precision Point for the fourth consecutive day, still analyzing targets and interviewing witnesses. The man had transformed what should have been a casual shooting range visit into a detailed forensic investigation. "Mr. Pemberton," Webb said, showing his identification, "I understand you've been asking questions about an incident that occurred here recently." Pemberton looked up from the chronograph he had been using to measure bullet velocities. "Are you here about the shooting performance? I've been documenting evidence that suggests—" "I'm here to suggest you stop documenting anything," Webb interrupted. "This investigation is interfering with an ongoing police matter." "Police matter?" Pemberton's eyes brightened with interest. "I knew there was something unusual about this case. The shooting skills I've heard described are consistent with professional military training at the highest levels." Webb kept his expression neutral. "Mr. Pemberton, I'm going to explain something to you once, and I need you to listen carefully. Sometimes former soldiers prefer to keep their service records private. When civilians start asking detailed questions about their capabilities, it can create problems that extend far beyond idle curiosity." "What kind of problems?" "The kind that result in people disappearing permanently," Webb said bluntly. "I'm advising you to abandon this investigation immediately and forget everything you think you've discovered." Pemberton stared at him for several seconds, processing the implications. "Are you suggesting this individual is in some kind of danger?" "I'm suggesting that continuing to publicize his capabilities could put him in danger, and anyone else who gets too interested in his background." The warning was clear enough that even Pemberton's academic obsession couldn't ignore it. He began packing his equipment with obvious reluctance. "Will there be any official report about this incident?" "There never was any incident," Webb replied. "Just some good shooting by a private individual who values his privacy." Webb's next stop was Dr. Foster's office. The military psychologist needed to understand that her casual conversation about veteran behavior patterns might have created a security risk. "I should have been more careful," Dr. Foster admitted after Webb explained the situation. "When dealing with classified service records, even theoretical discussions can have real-world consequences." "What's your assessment of Mitchell's mental state?" Webb asked. Foster considered the question carefully. "Based on what you've told me, he's exhibiting classic signs of a high-functioning veteran who's been successfully managing his transition to civilian life. The shooting range incident sounds like a momentary reversion to old patterns, not a psychological breakdown. But the exposure could trigger other problems." "Absolutely. If he's been living under an assumed identity for security reasons, having that identity compromised could destabilize his entire adaptation process. He might start exhibiting more aggressive defensive behaviors." Webb made a note to monitor James's behavior for signs of increased paranoia or aggression. The last thing London needed was a former Special Forces operator having a psychological crisis in public. Meanwhile, James was dealing with his own damage control measures. He had submitted his resignation from the Queen's Guard, citing family circumstances that required him to relocate. The paperwork would take several days to process, but his commanding officer had agreed to grant immediate leave pending the transfer. James spent those days systematically erasing his presence from London. He closed bank accounts, terminated his lease, and destroyed any documents that might link him to his current identity. It was a process he had learned during his military service, when operational security required the ability to disappear completely on short notice. But even as he prepared to vanish again, James was aware that his time might already be running out. The shooting range incident had created a trail of inquiries and investigations that could be traced by anyone with sufficient resources and motivation, and James knew exactly the kind of people who possessed both. His fears were confirmed when Colin Hayes, Webb's former SAS contact, received a disturbing phone call from a man claiming to represent a private security firm interested in locating former regiment personnel for employment opportunities. "We're looking for individuals with specific skill sets," the caller explained, "particularly those with advanced marksmanship training who might currently be working in civilian security positions." Colin's military instincts immediately went on alert. Legitimate security firms didn't conduct personnel searches by describing specific capabilities. This sounded like someone fishing for information about a particular individual. I don't provide information about former colleagues, Colin replied carefully. Of course not. We're simply hoping you might be aware of anyone who fits this profile. There was a recent incident at a London shooting range that suggests such an individual might be in the area. Colin ended the call immediately and contacted Webb. You were right to be concerned, he told the detective. Someone's definitely looking for your mysterious shooter, and they're not being subtle about it. Webb felt his stomach drop. The situation was escalating exactly as he had feared. Any idea who? No, but they knew enough about the shooting range incident to reference it specifically. This isn't random inquiries. Someone has been tracking the story and following leads. Webb immediately tried to contact James, but the phone number went to a disconnected message. When he drove to James's address in Bermondsey, he found the flat empty, with clear signs of a hasty but thorough departure. The next morning brought more troubling news. Frank, the rangemaster at Precision Point, called Webb to report that two men in expensive suits had visited the range, asking detailed questions about the mysterious shooter. They had shown credentials claiming to represent a government agency, but Frank's police training told him something wasn't right about their story. They wanted copies of the security footage, Frank explained. Said it was part of a national security investigation. But their IDs looked wrong, and they didn't follow proper procedure for requesting evidence. Webb cursed under his breath. Professional investigators with fake credentials could only mean one thing. James Mitchell's past had finally caught up with him, and his enemies were closing in. But James was already several steps ahead of his pursuers. Instead of fleeing London immediately, which would have been the obvious response, he had chosen a more subtle approach. He was using skills learned in hostile territory to turn the hunters into the hunted. From a hotel room in Canary Wharf, James monitored the investigation into his background using techniques that would have been familiar to any intelligence operative. He tracked the fake government agents through credit card records accessed via methods that remained classified. He identified the private security firm that had contacted Colin Hayes through telephone records that officially didn't exist. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears. The people looking for him weren't random criminals seeking revenge. They were professional cleaners, the kind of specialists employed by intelligence agencies to eliminate inconvenient witnesses. And they were working for people who had the resources to track him anywhere in the world. James's military service had included operations that could never be officially acknowledged, missions that had prevented terrorist attacks and eliminated threats to national security. But those same missions had also created enemies among powerful individuals who would face serious consequences if certain information ever became public. 3 years of anonymous life as a palace guard had allowed James to hope that his enemies had given up the search. The shooting range incident had destroyed that illusion and confirmed that his former handlers considered him too dangerous to leave alive. Now James faced a choice that would define the rest of his life, however long that might be. He could disappear again, spend years looking over his shoulder while his enemies continued hunting him. Or he could take a more permanent approach to the problem. The training that had made James one of the most effective snipers in British military history included more than marksmanship. He had learned surveillance techniques, infiltration methods, and elimination procedures that could be applied to targets other than enemy combatants. As James began planning his response to the threat, he drew on skills that he had hoped never to use again. But the people hunting him had made the mistake of underestimating their prey. They thought they were tracking a former soldier trying to hide from his past. They had no idea they were being stalked by a predator who had decided to stop running. Detective Inspector Webb, meanwhile, was trying to coordinate a response with limited resources and unclear authority. The fake government agents had vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving no trace except Frank's description and the growing certainty that James Mitchell was in immediate danger. Webb's request for official support was denied by superiors who didn't want to get involved in what appeared to be an intelligence matter. As far as the Metropolitan Police was concerned, James Mitchell was a former soldier with no current legal problems who had chosen to leave London of his own accord. But Webb couldn't abandon the investigation. Something about James Mitchell's quiet dignity during their park conversation had convinced the detective that he was dealing with a good man caught in circumstances beyond his control. If professional killers were hunting James, then someone needed to level the playing field. Webb began his own unauthorized investigation into the private security firm that had been asking questions about former SAS personnel. What he discovered made him realize that the shooting range incident had triggered something much larger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. James Mitchell wasn't just hiding from his past. He was the key to exposing a network of illegal operations that reached into the highest levels of government and intelligence services. And now that his enemies had found him, they weren't going to stop until he was permanently silenced. The quiet man who had just wanted to practice his marksmanship in peace was about to become the center of a war fought in London's shadows, where the stakes were measured in state secrets and the price of failure was death. The warehouse in Rotherhithe had been abandoned for 18 months, another casualty of London's shifting industrial landscape. To anyone passing by, it appeared empty and forgotten. But James Mitchell had spent 3 days transforming it into something else entirely, a fortress designed by someone who understood how professional killers operated. He had chosen the location carefully, multiple exit routes, clear sight lines in all directions, and, most importantly, a commanding view of the surrounding area that would allow him to see his enemies long before they could reach him. The building's industrial architecture provided natural defensive positions that he had enhanced with modifications that would be invisible to casual observation. James positioned himself on the 3rd floor, behind a makeshift sniper's nest constructed from shipping crates and steel beams. His rifle was a precision instrument he had acquired through channels that didn't exist in any official records, military-grade equipment that transformed him back into the weapon he had once been. Through the scope, James could see Detective Inspector Webb's car approaching the warehouse district. The policeman was early for their scheduled meeting, which meant he was either very punctual or very nervous. James had contacted Webb through secure channels, requesting help that went well beyond normal police procedure. Webb parked 2 blocks away and approached on foot, following the route James had specified. As the detective entered the warehouse through the designated entrance, James tracked his progress through security cameras he had installed throughout the building. 3rd floor, James called out when Webb reached the main stairwell. Walk slowly and keep your hands visible. Webb climbed the stairs with the careful movements of someone who understood he was entering the territory of a highly skilled and potentially dangerous individual. When he reached James's position, he found the former soldier crouched behind a rifle that could have eliminated targets at distances Webb couldn't even see clearly. "Thank you for coming," James said without taking his eyes off the scope. "You said on the phone that you had identified your pursuers," Webb replied, settling into a position where he could observe the approaches to the building. 2 teams, professionals with excellent equipment and unlimited resources. They've been systematically tracking everyone who was present at the shooting range, eliminating potential witnesses. Webb felt a chill. Eliminating how? Sarah, the shooting instructor, died in a car accident yesterday. Single vehicle collision, no witnesses. Frank, the range master, had a heart attack this morning. Very sudden, no previous history of cardiac problems. You think they were murdered? James finally looked away from his scope to meet Webb's eyes. I know they were murdered. These people specialize in deaths that appear accidental. It's their signature method. Webb pulled out his phone to verify the information, but James held up a hand to stop him. Don't make any calls. They're monitoring communications around anyone connected to this case. That includes you now. Then how do we stop them? James returned to his scope, making minute adjustments to the rifle's position. We don't stop them. I stop them. But I need you to understand something first. The people hunting me aren't criminals in any conventional sense. They're sanctioned operators working for intelligence services that technically don't exist. Sanctioned by whom? People whose careers would be destroyed if certain operations I participated in ever became public knowledge. Black operations that prevented terrorist attacks but used methods that violated every international law regarding warfare and human rights. Webb absorbed this information. You're a witness to war crimes. I'm a witness to necessary actions taken to prevent mass casualties. But legally speaking, yes, war crimes. And the people who authorized those actions have decided that maintaining their secrets is worth more than my life. Through the warehouse windows, Webb could see unmarked vehicles taking positions around the building. The hunters had found their prey, but they had no idea what they were walking into. James had spent his military career in situations where he was outnumbered and outgunned by enemies who wanted him dead. He had survived by being smarter, more patient, and more ruthless than anyone hunting him. Those skills hadn't diminished during his 3 years as a palace guard. How many? Webb asked, watching the tactical deployment taking place outside. 12 divided into 3 teams. Professional soldiers, probably former special forces from various countries. They're equipped for a siege operation, expecting to find me barricaded and desperate. Are you barricaded and desperate? James smiled for the first time since Webb had known him. It wasn't a pleasant expression. I'm prepared and angry. There's a significant difference. The first team moved toward the warehouse's main entrance, while the second team positioned themselves to cover the rear exits. The third team, equipped with sniper rifles, took elevated positions in surrounding buildings. It was a textbook approach for eliminating a dangerous individual who had gone to ground. But James had anticipated their tactics because he had used identical procedures in his own operations. He knew exactly how professional hunters thought, because he had been one himself. "They'll use flashbang grenades to disorient me, then rush the building with overwhelming force," James explained to Webb. "Standard procedure for dealing with a cornered target. How do we counter that?" "We don't. I counter that. You're going to leave now. Through the route we discussed. In 20 minutes, contact your superiors and report that you received an anonymous tip about a terrorist cell operating from this warehouse." Webb understood immediately. "You're going to eliminate them all and make it look like a counter-terrorism operation. I'm going to neutralize threats to my safety using appropriate force. The interpretation of events will depend on who controls the narrative afterward." Webb started to object, but James cut him off. "Detective, these people have killed at least 2 innocent civilians to cover their tracks. They're planning to kill me and anyone else who knows about their operation. This isn't a police matter anymore, it's a military action." The first flashbang grenade detonated in the warehouse's ground floor, the concussive blast designed to disorient anyone hiding inside. James felt the building shake but remained focused on his scope, tracking the assault team's approach with the calm precision that had made him legendary among his former colleagues. The hunters expected to find their quarry stunned and confused by the explosive entry. Instead, they encountered carefully positioned booby traps that channeled their movement into predetermined kill zones. James had turned the warehouse into a maze designed to separate and isolate the assault teams. The first sniper fell to James's rifle before the assault team even reached the second floor. 800 meters away, through a window that should have provided perfect concealment, the enemy marksman simply ceased to exist. James's shot was so precise that the other snipers didn't immediately realize their colleague was dead. Webb had reached his car and was driving away when he heard the distinctive crack of high-velocity rifle fire echoing through the warehouse district. By the time he reached a safe distance to make the phone call that would bring official response teams to the scene, the shooting had stopped. When armed police units arrived at the warehouse 23 minutes later, they found the aftermath of what appeared to be a sophisticated counter-terrorism operation. 12 bodies, all carrying illegal weapons and false identification documents. Equipment that suggested a planned assault on unknown targets, and a single sniper's position that had been abandoned so professionally that it yielded no forensic evidence. James Mitchell had vanished again, leaving behind only questions that officials preferred not to answer publicly. The dead men were identified as mercenaries with connections to various international conflicts, but their specific mission in London remained classified. Detective Inspector Webb filed a report stating that he had received an anonymous tip about suspicious activity in the warehouse district. The tip had proven accurate, resulting in the disruption of what appeared to be a terrorist cell preparing for an attack on civilian targets. No mention was made of former SAS snipers or shooting range incidents. The official narrative focused on successful police work preventing potential terrorism, and everyone involved agreed that some details were too sensitive for public disclosure. 3 months later, Webb received a postcard from Scotland showing a remote highland landscape. The message was brief: "Found a better place to practice. Thank you for your assistance. J.M." The shooting range at Precision Point reopened with new management after Frank's tragic death. Gerald Pemberton never returned, having lost interest in competitive shooting after his conversation with Webb.
The tax rate dated from the Part B.
The story of the mysterious marksman became an urban legend, told and retold until it bore no resemblance to actual events. But in certain circles, military veterans, intelligence professionals, and those who dealt with classified operations, whispers persisted about a ghost sniper who had eliminated an entire kill team without leaving a trace. The whispers spoke of someone who had turned the hunters into the hunted, who had used skills supposedly reserved for foreign enemies against threats operating on British soil. James Mitchell had found his peace, not through hiding from his capabilities, but by using them to protect himself and others. The quiet man who had just wanted to practice his marksmanship had reminded the intelligence community that some weapons, once forged, could never be safely discarded. In the remote Scottish Highlands, far from shooting ranges and curious observers, James continued his practice. But now he shot without fear of discovery, knowing that his enemies understood the cost of hunting a predator who refused to remain prey. The palace guards continued their ceremonial duties without him. Tourists continued taking pictures, and life in London moved on. But somewhere in the classified files of various intelligence agencies, a name had been quietly added to a very short list of individuals who should never again be considered potential targets. James Mitchell, the ridiculed royal guard who had been unaware of his own legend, had reminded the world exactly why he had earned that legend in the first place. And in doing so, he had finally found the peace that comes not from hiding your true nature, but from ensuring that those who would threaten it understand the consequences of their mistake.
The shooting range incident had ended not with his capture or elimination, but with the recognition that some ghosts are better left undisturbed. Some skills, once demonstrated, command respect even from those who had forgotten why such respect was necessary.
And sometimes the quiet man in the corner knows exactly who he is and what he's capable of, even when everyone else underestimates him.